They called her just a nurse. That was the only name that mattered at Oak Creek Memorial. Not Sarah. Not Chen. Just the quiet woman in scrubs who moved through the ICU corridors at night like she was trying not to take up space in the world. Nobody knew the tremor in her hands wasn't weakness, it was restraint. Nobody saw the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden against her ribs like a secret heartbeat. They didn't know what those hands had done. They didn't know she'd held together things that should have fallen apart. Not yet. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial began the same way it always did. Sarah arrived at 11:47 p.m., clocked in without speaking to anyone, and moved through the ICU corridors with the kind of deliberate anonymity that only comes from practice. Her scrubs were always pressed. Her dark hair always pulled tight. The scar along her left forearm, thin, pale, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, stayed covered under long sleeves even in the San Diego heat. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, that constant electric drone that made your teeth ache if you listened too long. She never listened. The antiseptic smell hung thick in the recycled air, sharp enough to sting the back of her throat. Steel rails on the beds. Vinyl on the chairs. The cold metal railing of the medication cart under her fingers as she pulled it toward bed 7. She touched the patch through her jacket as she walked. Just for a second. Just to feel it was still there. Her fingers traced the worn fabric, the way the embroidery had started to fray at the edges after all these years. Sangin Valley. 23 months. 214 operations. That patch had been sewn into her jacket lining since the day she walked away from everything and became nobody again. The ICU was quiet. 11 beds, 3 occupied. Monitor beeps at regular intervals like a heartbeat that wasn't quite alive. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. Sarah moved between the patients with practiced efficiency, checking lines, reading monitors, adjusting for drips with hands that moved on their own, muscle memory that never forgot anything. 18 years of it. 18 years of motion so familiar it felt like breathing. She was reviewing the chart for bed 4 when the commotion started in the corridor. Not loud. Just different. The kind of controlled urgency that meant someone important had arrived. Sarah kept her eyes on the paperwork. Let other people look up. Let other people notice. She had learned a long time ago that invisible was safer than seen. The boy came through the doors at 2:15 a.m. 10 years old. Dark hair. Skin the color of old ivory. And eyes that didn't move, didn't track, didn't look for anything because they couldn't see anything at all. His father was behind him with a hand on his shoulder, steady, protective, the kind of grip that says I'm holding you up. She recognized him immediately, Admiral James Garrett, navy brass, dress whites visible underneath the civilian jacket he'd thrown on. The medical team had called it in an hour ago. Post-viral optic neuropathy. Sudden onset. Complete vision loss in both eyes over the course of 18 hours. The boy had been at soccer practice on Wednesday. Now he was blind. Dr. Sterling had admitted him to ICU overnight for observation and baseline imaging, though everyone in the hospital knew what that really meant. Waiting for the specialists to come back and tell the Admiral's family what they all already knew, nothing could be done. The damage was permanent. The nerves were dead. The specialists had already refused the experimental procedure, some cutting-edge immunotherapy protocol from Johns Hopkins that might restore partial vision if the inflammation hadn't progressed too far. Too risky, they'd said. Unproven. Liability. Never mind that the kid was already blind. Sarah stayed invisible through it all. She ran the baseline vitals. She settled the boy into the bed with movement so gentle he barely seemed to notice. She adjusted the 4-line with a 3-point stabilization technique, needle secure, tubing taped at the wrist and elbow with a backup loop at the shoulder, redundancy upon redundancy, the way you do it when failure isn't an option. The boy's father watched her hands move and asked if she'd done this before. She said yes. She didn't say how many times. She didn't say where. By 4 a.m., the ICU had settled back into its rhythm. The Admiral was sleeping in the recliner beside his son's bed, his dress uniform wrinkled now, the gold braid on his shoulders dull under the fluorescent lights. The boy slept too, his small hand gripping the side rail, his unseeing eyes closed like he was trying very hard to believe none of this was real. Sarah found herself reviewing the case file during the quiet part of the shift, that window between 3 and 5 a.m. when nobody else was awake except the machines. The imaging reports were in the system. The specialist notes were there too, each one more dismissive than the last. Irreversible neural degeneration. No therapeutic intervention indicated. Prognosis, permanent blindness. The words were efficient. Medical. They had the weight of authority and finality. Except the Johns Hopkins protocol was there too, filed under experimental procedures. 23 pages of methodology. Success rates. Contraindications. The treatment window was 72 hours from symptom onset. The boy had 20 hours left. The procedure used a combination of antivirals and targeted immunotherapy to suppress the inflammatory cascade that was destroying the optic nerve. In the right cases, caught early enough, with the right patient profile, it had a 47% chance of restoring useful vision. 47% chance. Which meant better than nothing. Which meant the boy might see again. The Admiral was awake. Sarah hadn't heard him move, but she sensed it the way you do when someone's watching you. She turned from the computer terminal and found him standing in the corridor with his arms crossed, his dress uniform somehow even more wrinkled than it had been 3 hours ago. His eyes were the color of the Atlantic in winter. Hard. Gray. The kind of eyes that had seen people die and had learned to live with it. The experimental procedure, he said quietly. You reviewed it. I was reading the case file. You know what it says. She looked at him. She looked at the boy through the glass partition, still sleeping, still reaching for something he couldn't see. She said, it has a 47% success rate if the window is still open. It hasn't been 72 hours yet. Every specialist in California says it's too risky. They're protecting their liability. The words were out before she could stop them. Too direct. Too confident. The kind of thing a night shift nurse wasn't supposed to say to an admiral. She braced for the correction, the dismissal, the subtle anger that comes when someone oversteps. Instead, the Admiral just nodded like she'd confirmed something he already knew. What would you do? He asked. Sarah looked away. I'm just a nurse. You know the protocol better than anyone here does. I watched you read it. I watched your hands move. You were looking for something specific. She couldn't answer that. Not honestly. Not without saying things that would lead to questions she couldn't answer. She folded the case file closed. Dr. Sterling makes those decisions. The Admiral's jaw tightened. Dr. Sterling has already decided it's impossible. That was true. She'd heard Sterling on rounds yesterday, dismissing the Hopkins protocol as unproven fantasy, as though hope itself was a disease that needed to be medicated away. Sterling was a good surgeon. Good enough to be chief. Good enough to have earned that position and the politics that came with it. He'd climbed high enough that he couldn't afford to take risks. Experimental procedures were careers in waiting, all of them potential disasters, all of them lawsuits waiting to happen. The Admiral left 15 minutes later, still carrying the weight of his son's blindness like it was a tactical failure he couldn't quite accept. Sarah watched him go. She touched the patch through her jacket. She tried not to think about another hospital, another desperate father, another child, and the difference between what was possible and what people were willing to do. That was when she felt the presence. The very specific, very particular feeling of being watched with recognition. She turned and found a man standing in the corridor just outside the supply room, mid-50s, trauma surgeon's bearing, someone who'd seen things and had learned to move quietly afterward. Dr. Webb. Trauma attending. Navy Reserve. He was standing very still, watching her hands where they rested on the medication cart. She knew that look. She'd seen it before, a long time ago, on the faces of people who understood what it meant when a person moved with precision. When their hands remembered things their mouth would never say. When their fingers knew the difference between vital and dead. Webb's eyes locked with hers for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward the trauma bays without speaking a word. Sarah didn't move. She didn't breathe. She stood in the corridor of Oak Creek Memorial with her hands on a medication cart and felt something that had been buried for 6 years start to surface. The Admiral's son slept behind glass, blind and dreaming of things he would never see. The boy's father carried the weight of his own helplessness. And somewhere in the hospital, a trauma surgeon with military bearing had just seen through the mask of a night shift nurse and recognized what was underneath. She was still invisible. For now. But something had shifted. The night was changing. And by the time morning came, nothing in this hospital was going to stay the same. The night was changing. And by the time morning came, nothing in this hospital was going to stay the same. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the hallway like a scalpel. Admiral Garrett. If you have a moment, I'd like to discuss a personnel matter in your son's room. Sarah's hand stilled. She knew. She had felt Sterling watching her for 3 days, ever since the Admiral had asked her questions about the experimental protocol, questions Sarah shouldn't have answered but had anyway. The boy lay in the hospital bed, his small frame outlined beneath the white sheets, his unseeing eyes fixed toward the window where morning light filtered through the blinds. He wasn't looking at anything anymore. That was the terrible arithmetic of blindness at 10 years old, the whole world suddenly reduced to sound and touch and the weight of a future he couldn't see. Admiral Garrett stood when Sterling entered, his uniform still crisp despite 72 hours without sleep. His hand rested on his son's shoulder. The boy didn't move. Nurse Chen, Sterling said, and his tone made the fluorescent light seem brighter, hotter. Tell the Admiral what you were doing reviewing his son's case file at 2 in the morning. Sarah's jaw moved once, held, released. Checking baseline vitals before shift change, doctor. And yet, Sterling continued, moving to the foot of the bed with his hands clasped in front of him like a man about to deliver a sermon. You somehow found time to discuss experimental procedures with the Admiral here. Procedures that are, shall we say, outside the scope of nursing practice. His eyes were cold blue, the kind of cold that came from certainty. From never being told no. Tell me, Nightingale, did you attend medical school in your spare time? Or do you just play doctor when real physicians aren't looking? The nickname landed like a punch aimed at her ribs. Nightingale. Because she worked nights. Because she was quiet. Because Sterling needed a way to make her smaller. Sarah met his eyes. One breath. Her hand stayed at her sides, palms open, steady as surgical steel. I was answering a parent's question about options, doctor. Options that don't exist for this patient, Sterling said. His voice dropped, which made it worse. Controlled anger was always worse than shouting. The experimental protocol carries a 70% complication rate, Admiral. Blindness that becomes permanent neurological damage. And your son's condition, post-viral optic neuropathy with inflammatory cascade, makes him unsuitable. It was rejected by every specialist in Southern California for reasons that require actual medical training to understand. Sterling turned to Sarah. Not nursing school training. Not a night shift observations. Medical training. Admiral Garrett's hand tightened on his son's shoulder. She was helpful, doctor. She explained. She overstepped, Sterling interrupted. And she will be disciplined accordingly. He pulled a folder from under his arm. Inside was a single sheet of paper he'd already begun filling out, his handwriting precise and damning. Scope of practice violation. Providing medical advice beyond licensure. Undermining physician authority in front of a patient's family. Each line was a bullet, each bullet a small death. Nurse Chen, you are hereby receiving a formal written warning. This will be placed in your personnel file and posted on the unit board. You will not discuss case protocols with patients or families unless specifically directed by a physician. You will not review files outside your assigned shift. And you will certainly not encourage false hope about procedures that are medically contraindicated. Sarah watched him write. The pen moved with the same precision she'd used to apply tourniquets in places where the sand was the color of old blood. Different tool. Same execution. Do you understand? Sterling asked, not looking up. Yes, Doctor. I'm not sure you do, Sterling said, and now he smiled, which was the worst part. The smile of a man who had found the thing that made you flinch and was going to use it. See, most nurses understand hierarchy. They understand that they work at the pleasure of physicians. They understand that their job is to follow orders, not question them. But you seem to have some confusion about your place here at Oak Creek. He slid the disciplinary form across the bedside table toward her. Sign it. Sarah's fingers moved across the paper. Sarah Chen. Her real name in her real handwriting, on a real document that would become part of the permanent record of a nurse who didn't exist anywhere except here, now, in a hospital in San Diego where no one knew who she really was. She signed without pressure, without hesitation, the way she'd signed clearance forms in military hospitals 12 years ago. Thank you, Sterling said, taking the paper back with the satisfaction of a man who had just won something. Admiral, I apologize for this interruption. Your son is in good hands, professional hands, who understand the limits of their expertise. He looked at Sarah when he said it. I'll check on him this afternoon. Please don't let anyone else disturb him with theoretical discussions. The door closed behind him. Admiral Garrett sat back down. His son asked what was happening, and the Admiral's voice was carefully level when he said, "Nothing, buddy. Nothing at all." But Sarah was already leaving. The break room smelled like old coffee and the chemical sweetness of artificial vanilla from the creamer someone had left open 3 days ago. Sarah unwrapped her sandwich, turkey, no mayo, the same thing she ate every night, and sat at the table by the window that overlooked the parking lot. The rain had started again, drumming against the glass like Morse code, like a message in a language only people who'd lived in the dark understood. She'd been sitting there for 90 seconds when the door opened. Nurse Martinez, who'd helped Sarah through the first week of night shift, smiling. Hey, Chen. You got, she stopped. Her smile didn't fall so much as evaporate. Oh. You know what, I just realized I left something in my locker. Back in a minute. She was gone before Sarah could respond. 2 minutes later, Nurse Kwan entered, began making her coffee, saw Sarah, and suddenly remembered she needed to check on something in the supply room. The coffee machine beeped. No one was there to retrieve it. Nurse Rodriguez was next, the one Sarah had stayed late to help after her daughter was admitted to pediatrics last month. Rodriguez took one look at Sarah, took one look at the disciplinary notice that Sterling had already posted on the unit board, the one with Sarah's name circled in red marker like a target, and made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. She left her dinner in the refrigerator and didn't come back. Sarah sat alone at the table, rain drumming like a heartbeat that wasn't hers anymore. She unwrapped her sandwich. Took a bite. Chewed. Swallowed. These were the things you did when no one was looking. These were the things you did to stay human when the world was narrowing, when the walls were moving closer, when you were beginning to understand that there was no place in this hospital where you could exist without being made smaller. And then one tear, just one, escaped without permission. Sarah's hand moved with the same precision she'd used to stop bleeding, to stabilize fractures, to hold people together when their bodies were coming apart. She wiped the tear before it could fall. Before it could be seen. Before it could become proof that she could break. She looked at her hands. Steady. The tremor was gone. It had left her body at some point in the last 72 hours, the way trauma left bodies sometimes, not gradually, but in an instant of shift, of settling, of understanding that you either held on or you didn't, and either way, the rain still fell. Sometimes the hardest part of medicine is watching people choose politics over patients, she whispered. Not to anyone. Not to the empty room. Just to herself, the way prayers work when you've stopped believing in God but you haven't stopped believing that meaning existed somewhere, in the quiet hours, in the space between heartbeats. The rain continued. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn. And somewhere in the hospital, Admiral Garrett sat with his blind son and read aloud from a book the boy couldn't see, each word a small act of faith that vision could be restored, that sight was something you could give back to the people you loved if you just fought hard enough. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was yet to come, waiting in the darkness of the intensive care unit, waiting for midnight, waiting for the moment when Sarah would be alone with a child whose body was going to betray him in ways no pediatric protocol could prevent, and everything she'd hidden for 23 years would suddenly be the only thing that could save him. Dr. Webb froze halfway down the corridor, his chart dropping to his side. Sarah was adjusting the boys for line with a specific three-point stabilization technique, needle angled at precisely 23 degrees, thumb braced against the port, fingers spread to distribute pressure across the vein wall. She wasn't thinking about it. Her hands just moved that way. The way hands move when they've held pressure on arterial bleeds in the dark. When they've done this 1,000 times under conditions that would make most people scream. Webb was Army. Kandahar. 2009, he'd seen field medics work. He knew what combat-trained hands looked like. He pulled her aside into an empty supply closet, his voice dropping to barely audible. You served. I was Army, Kandahar, but I know a combat medic's hands when I see them. Sarah's face went pale. Not red. Not trembling. Pale. Like someone had flipped a switch and drained the blood from her cheeks. For 23 years, she had moved through Oak Creek Memorial as invisible as the night shift itself, another set of scrubs, another voice calling vitals, another person the attending physicians forgot to learn the name of. The armor of anonymity, built brick by brick, had just cracked. Webb saw it. Saw her. Saw straight through the carefully constructed Sarah Chen, night shift RN, to whatever lay underneath. She didn't answer him. She just finished the 4-line, smooth, efficient, finished, and walked past him into the hallway without a word. That silence was the answer he needed. But Webb wasn't the problem. Webb was the least of the problems forming like storm cells across the hospital's administrative floors. Dr. Sterling sat in the hospital's mahogany-paneled conference room on the 3rd floor, surrounded by board members whose loyalty was currency he'd been collecting for years. 3 of them owed him favors from previous political battles, the pediatric wing expansion funding he'd helped secure, the trauma center certification he'd orchestrated, the scandal he'd managed to bury when one of them had made a mistake that could have ended careers. Now it was time to cash those chips in. He opened a presentation on the conference table's flat screen, and the first slide appeared, experimental procedures, liability exposure analysis. The numbers climbed. Infection rates. Failed outcomes. Family litigation. The data was accurate, he wouldn't dare use bad data with this crowd, but the context was shaped like a scalpel. He highlighted one case in particular, pediatric post-viral optic neuropathy, experimental immunosuppressive protocol, high-profile military family with unrealistic expectations. He didn't mention the Admiral by name. He didn't have to. Everyone in this room knew exactly whose case he meant. If we authorize this procedure, Sterling said, his voice carrying the practiced weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and the outcome is poor, we're exposing the hospital to federal litigation. Military families have resources. They have advocates. They have lawyers who specialize in medical malpractice. He paused, letting that sink in. And they have the capacity to make our reputation very, very difficult. The board members nodded. Of course they nodded. Sterling wasn't asking them to choose between medicine and profit. He was framing it as a choice between safety and recklessness. Between careful stewardship and dangerous hubris. The poison was in the framing, not the words. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. By the time Sterling left, he had what he needed: tacit board support for restricting experimental procedures, a framework for denying the Admiral's case access to the protocol, and 3 votes in his pocket if anyone challenged him. 3 votes tied directly to people whose secrets he kept and whose interests he protected. The next morning, Sterling called Oak Creek's military liaison, a retired Army chaplain named Colonel Merrick who handled hospital relationships with the Department of Defense and active duty families. Sterling's voice on the phone was casual, concerned, the way a colleague speaks to a colleague about a mutual worry. "Colonel, I wanted to give you a heads up about something before it becomes a larger issue. We have a high-profile military family, the Garrett case, and I'm concerned about the expectations they may have regarding experimental treatment protocols that we're not in a position to safely provide. I've also noticed some irregular communication patterns between our nursing staff and the family that suggest, perhaps, a lack of professional boundaries." He paused. "Let Merrick absorb that. I'm not suggesting anything untoward, Colonel. But given the military community's trust in our institution, I thought you should be aware that we may need to review the credentials of some of our nursing personnel to ensure they're meeting current standards. The last thing we want is a situation where a family believes they've received medical guidance from someone who isn't properly qualified." Sterling hung up knowing exactly what would happen next. Colonel Merrick would pull Sarah's personnel file. Merrick would see that she was an RN with no advanced certifications, no specialties, no letters after her name that indicated anything beyond basic nursing credentials. He wouldn't see the thing that mattered. He wouldn't see Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen, field surgeon, combat medic, the kind of person who operated on human beings in Sangin while bullets came through the walls like angry hornets. He would see a night shift nurse who might have overstepped her scope of practice. Sarah learned about the board meeting from another nurse, Jenny from pediatrics, who felt guilty enough about the break room isolation to slip her a message. Sterling called an emergency meeting. "Your name came up. The Admirals case. They're saying no experimental procedures. Board decision." That evening, Sarah tried to approach the Admiral's room during visiting hours. A charge nurse stopped her at the door, her expression apologetic but firm. "You've been reassigned. Sterling's orders. ICU only, no contact with pediatric cases until further notice." Sarah didn't argue. She never argued. She turned and walked to the stairwell, the one that no one used after 8 p.m., the one with the humming fluorescent light that flickered in an irregular rhythm like failing Morse code. She stood there in the darkness, her hand touching the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one from Sangin, from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Detachment, the patch she'd hidden inside that jacket for 23 years because some things couldn't be spoken about. They could only be carried. Her breathing accelerated. Not panic. Not fear. The kind of breathing that comes before action, the kind her body did automatically when something needed doing and the time to do it was collapsing like a building in an earthquake. She forced it slower. Forced her hands into her pockets. Forced herself to think like a nurse again instead of like a senior chief who'd held her own guts in her hands while waiting for medevac. That night, she walked past the boy's room during her ICU rounds. The door was open. She could hear him crying softly, asking his father, "Dad, is being blind my punishment? Did I do something bad?" Admiral Garrett's response was barely audible, his voice the sound of a man whose entire world had contracted to the size of a hospital room. "No, son. Sometimes the people who can help just choose not to." Sarah kept walking. Her jaw clenched so hard her molars ached, but she kept walking. The next morning, a new memo appeared on the unit board. It was printed on official hospital letterhead, signed by Dr. Sterling, marked "Mandatory for all nursing staff." The policy was titled Professional Communication Guidelines for Patient-Family Interaction, and it was specific. Detailed. Written like someone had gone through a checklist of exactly what Sarah had done wrong. Clause 3.2 read, "No nursing staff shall discuss treatment options, alternative protocols, or medical recommendations with any patient or family member without written physician authorization and physician presence." Recent incidents indicate a pattern of unauthorized clinical consultation by nursing personnel outside their scope of practice. This policy is effective immediately and violations will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. The memo included her name. Not hidden. Not implied. Written directly into the policy as the catalyst for the rule itself. Every nurse on the unit would read that memo and know exactly who it was about. They would know Sarah had crossed a line. They would know Dr. Sterling had drawn it in permanent ink. And then Sterling himself appeared at the end of the pediatric corridor, making direct eye contact with Sarah as she stood reading the memo. He was standing near the Admiral's room. He was standing where he could see her seeing it. His expression was pleasant. His smile was thin. It was the smile of someone who had just removed all the pieces of the board except the ones that served him. The message was clear. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A command written in institutional language, backed by board authority, built into policy, made permanent. The monitor alarm at 2:47 a.m. sounded like a scream nobody else could hear. Sarah was charting at the night station when the pediatric ICU call light flickered, not urgent, just a notification. She didn't know yet that sound would be the pivot point. She didn't know everything she'd buried for 3 years was about to surface in the next 8 minutes. She walked into the Admiral's son's room and found him seizing, not convulsive, but something worse. His lips had turned the color of slate. His neck veins distended like rope pulling tight under skin. The monitor showed a pressure wave climbing. Intracranial pressure spiking hard. His oxygen saturation dropping in real time, 94, 88, 82. The ventilator labored. "Get me a crash cart," Sarah said. Not a request. Ice in her voice. The night nurse standing there froze. She'd never heard that tone from the quiet woman in scrubs. Sarah was already moving. Now. And call the ICU resident. The boy's blood pressure bottomed out at 62/39. His heart rate climbed to 147. He was coding on the inside. Something in his chest was compressing his heart. Fluid, maybe. Blood. The medication they changed yesterday, there had been a note in the file about rare post-viral reactions, about a 1 in 10,000 chance of inflammatory response causing fluid accumulation. 1 in 10,000. The Admiral's son had just become those odds. Sarah's hands moved on their own. Muscle memory that had nothing to do with the past 3 years of anonymous night shifts. She prepped the pericardiocentesis kit, 18-gauge needle, ultrasound probe, syringe. The equipment felt like coming home to a place she'd never meant to return. "Sir," she said, and her voice had dropped an octave. The Admiral stood frozen in the doorway. "Sir, I need you to hold his hand. Keep him talking. This will hurt, but it will save his life." She didn't wait for permission. The boy's lips were turning blue. His heart was being crushed by fluid pressing against it from inside the pericardial sac. She prepped the insertion site with betadine, the iodine smell sharp and chemical. She positioned the needle beneath the xiphoid process, angled it 45 degrees toward the left shoulder, felt the resistance of tissue, and pushed through. The hiss of air escaping as the syringe filled. Bloody fluid. Dark. She pulled back on the plunger with a steady hand and watched the pressure release, the fluid flowing into the syringe like poison draining from a wound. 50 milliliters. 60. 70. The boy gasped. His oxygen saturation climbed, 84, 90, 93. His color returned like someone flipping a switch. Pink returning to his lips. His chest rising with easier breaths. The heart monitor showed sinus rhythm again, strong, regular, alive. Sarah disposed of sharps into the red container, her movements precise as surgical instruments. Every motion exactly where it needed to be. She turned to the night nurse. "Get me continuous cardiac monitoring. Notify the ICU resident he's stabilized. Start a drip of normal saline at 15 mils per hour." "Yes," the nurse whispered. Not a title anyone had ever given her at Oak Creek Memorial. The Admiral was still holding his son's hand, staring at Sarah like she'd just walked out of a classified file. "You just saved his life," he said. His life was already being saved the moment he got to the hospital, Sarah said. Her voice was steady as a surgical laser. I just removed the thing trying to kill him. The code team arrived at 2:55 a.m., 8 minutes too late to do anything but watch what was already done. They stood in the doorway, respiratory therapy and ICU residents and 2 attending physicians, all of them reading a monitor that was reading normal. All of them looking at the quiet night nurse in scrubs who'd just performed an emergency pericardiocentesis in a pediatric room with equipment and composure that didn't belong in a hospital night shift. Dr. Sterling arrived at 3:07 a.m. He took one look at the stable patient, the Admiral standing vigil, and the ultrasound cart Sarah had already returned to its position. His face went through 3 expressions in sequence: confusion, understanding, and then something that looked like a predator recognizing competition. "Charge nurse," he said. His voice was ice water. "Remove Nurse Chen from patient care immediately. Call security. Someone get legal on the phone. Now." Sarah was putting supplies away when the security officer arrived. She didn't resist. She didn't explain. She simply untied her badge and placed it on the desk like setting down a weapon. Within 60 minutes, Dr. Sterling had activated every network he possessed. By the time the sun rose over San Diego, he'd made 4 phone calls, each one calibrated to a different leverage point. The first call was to the hospital board president, an emergency meeting scheduled for 6 a.m. with board members who owed Sterling favors from years of funding their pet projects. The second call was to the military liaison, a retired Air Force colonel who handled all veteran affairs, asking pointed questions about Sarah's credentials and whether a non-credentialed individual had just performed an invasive procedure on an Admiral's child. The third call was to an external investigator, private, discreet, willing to examine personnel files for any irregularities that might justify immediate termination. The fourth call was to the hospital's legal counsel, preparing for the lawsuit that would definitely come. It wasn't aggression. It was strategy. Sterling was good at strategy. Sarah sat in the Human Resources conference room at dawn. The HR director, a woman named Patricia who'd hired her 3 years ago and had barely spoken to her since, read the suspension notice with the kind of careful distance that meant someone had already told her what to expect. Immediate suspension pending investigation into scope of practice violations and unauthorized medical intervention, Patricia read aloud. You are not to enter the hospital pending the investigation's outcome. You'll be contacted within 14 business days regarding the findings. I understand, Sarah said. There's a question about your credentials, Patricia continued, looking at her paperwork instead of Sarah. Some concern that you may have represented yourself as having medical training you don't actually possess. Sarah didn't blink. I have 32 years of accumulated medical experience. 23 of them were in emergency medicine. The investigation will examine that, Patricia said. She signed something without reading it. You can go. Sarah stood, and that's when she saw the Admiral in the hallway outside the conference room. He was still in his dress uniform from the night before, hollow-eyed, reaching for her arm as she passed. She kept walking. She couldn't meet his eyes. Couldn't let him see what was actually happening, that the thing she'd done to save his son was now the thing that was destroying her. That Sterling had weaponized her own competence, her own desperation to help, and turned it into the evidence he needed to erase her. 3 days later, Sarah sat in the waiting room of the VA hospital on 15th Avenue. The walls were institutional green, the kind that made you feel smaller instead of safer. Around her sat young men and women she recognized, not by name, but by the way they carried their shoulders. Combat veterans. Some of them had been in Sangin. Some of them had bled while she held their wounds closed. One of them, a corporal with a prosthetic left leg, looked at her and his eyes widened. Doc Chen? She turned away. That's when Admiral Garrett walked through the automatic doors with a folder in his hand and the expression of a man who'd just learned the truth. The administrative leave meeting took place in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and photocopier toner. Sarah sat at a laminate table across from 2 HR representatives and a union delegate who wouldn't meet her eyes. Dr. Sterling's written statement lay in front of her, 3 pages documenting her systematic violation of scope of practice, her dangerous interference in physician-directed care, and her insubordination in the presence of senior medical staff. The union delegate turned a page. The hospital is recommending a 30-day suspension pending investigation into your background and qualifications. Sarah didn't move. She'd chosen this job, the anonymous night shifts at Oak Creek Memorial, the obscurity of scrubs and name tags, specifically because she wanted to heal without being seen. She'd wanted to push her medication cart down corridors in silence, to hold the hands of the dying at 3 in the morning when nobody was watching, to matter without being known. She'd spent 18 years running from Sangin, from the weight of command decisions that had cost lives she couldn't save, from a sister who still called her voicemail asking where she'd gone. And now her past was walking through the hospital like a searchlight, and the only person defending that choice was gone. During the investigation, the second HR representative said, "You're not permitted on the unit. You'll be notified of the outcome within 2 weeks." She pushed a manila envelope across the table. "Your personnel file is sealed pending review. Someone will contact you." Sarah picked up the envelope. She didn't sign anything. She didn't argue. She just stood, and the union delegate finally looked at her, a long, uncomfortable stare that said, "I tried." That was the last moment Sarah had any illusions about what was coming. 3 days later, she walked into the San Diego VA hospital waiting room for her PTSD appointment at 10:30 in the morning. The fluorescent lights were identical to Oak Creek's, that same sterile white that drained color from everything it touched. The room was full of young men and women in various stages of healing, some with obvious wounds, prosthetics, wheelchairs, others with invisible scars written in the way they flinched at sudden noises or sat with their backs to the wall. Sarah recognized a 19-year-old corporal named Martinez who'd lost his left leg below the knee to an IED in Helmand Province. She'd treated him in the field hospital at Kandahar, held his hand while they prepped him for medevac. He was playing with his phone now, waiting for his name to be called, and he didn't look up. She recognized Jackson, too, the private who'd taken shrapnel in the shoulder. And Rivera, who'd been screaming when they brought him in. They were all here, all alive, all getting help in the peacetime world that Sarah had disappeared from. And Sarah realized, sitting in a plastic chair in a waiting room that smelled like cleaning solution and something else, something like regret, that this was what rock bottom actually looked like. Not the moment you fail. The moment you realize you've been failing alone while everyone you saved moves forward without you. The clinic called her name at 10:41. As she stood to walk toward the nurse's station, a man in hospital scrubs moving urgently down the hallway stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes found hers across the waiting room. He was older, 50 maybe, with a kind of face that had seen too much, and his expression shifted from neutral to something that looked like recognition mixed with shock. He whispered something in Pashto, and the word traveled across the room like a blade, the Angel of Sangin. He was a former Taliban fighter. Sarah's hands identified this before her mind could process it, the way he was being escorted by 2 security officers, the way his right arm was immobilized in a hospital sling, the way his medical wristband had a red alert flag. Medical asylum, probably. Someone had saved his life and brought him here, the way the system did sometimes, the way it tried to heal everyone regardless of which side they'd fought for. He stared at her like he'd seen a ghost, and Sarah understood in that moment that the person she'd been trying to bury was never really dead. She was just waiting in the ground for someone to dig her up. The Admiral's security clearance was high enough to access Sarah's classified file through official channels. It took him 2 days. He read through her entire service record, the commendations, the decorations, the incident reports from Sangin that had never made their way into the public record. He made phone calls to people who still owed him favors. One of those people was a 3-star Admiral named Patricia Chen, no relation to Sarah, but someone who remembered the operations, who remembered the medic who changed the trajectory of 3 separate firefights with nothing but training and nerve. By the time Admiral Garrett drove to Oak Creek Memorial on a Thursday morning, he knew exactly who'd saved his son's life. He wasn't angry. He was something much worse. He was grateful to someone that his institution had tried to destroy. The reinstatement hearing took place in the hospital lobby at 10 o'clock on a Friday morning. The hospital administrator stood at a podium that hadn't been there yesterday. News cameras from 3 local stations had been tipped off and were setting up on the hospital's marble floor, footage that would later circulate through medical networks across the entire West Coast. Sarah was supposed to be there, but she didn't know it yet. She was at home in her apartment, staring at her phone, waiting for some official notification. And then the Admiral's 10-year-old son walked into the hospital lobby with his father on one side and a guide dog on the other. His name was Michael, and 3 weeks earlier, experimental surgery had restored 70% of his vision to both eyes. He could see light now. He could see shapes. He could see his father's face, which he'd only known through touch for the past year of his life. Michael stepped forward without prompting, and a nurse from communications held a microphone toward him. His voice was small but steady. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen saved my life," he said. "When I couldn't see, when everyone said I'd never see again, she didn't give up. She did the thing that was right, even when it was hard. And she didn't even tell anyone. We should be named a hospital that respects people like that. People who do the right thing in the dark." The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning unit cycling. The Admiral touched his son's shoulder, and his own voice was steady as steel when he spoke into the microphone. "My son is alive. My son can see." This would not have happened if it weren't for Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. Everything else is just noise. And that's when the next voice came through the lobby speakers, because a SEAL team leader named Clayton Graves had just walked through the hospital's front doors, and he was speaking into his own microphone now. He'd driven 18 hours from his duty station to be here. He stood in full dress uniform, and he began to recite Sarah's service record like a prayer. "Bronze Star for operations in Helmand Province," he said. The assembled crowd was completely silent. "Bronze Star for tactical evacuation under fire in Sangin Valley." He paused. "Purple Heart for wounds sustained during the same operation." Another pause, longer this time. "And the Navy Cross for carrying for wounded sailors through enemy fire, 2,000 meters, in a firefight that lasted 43 minutes, with active RPG positions and automatic weapons fire from 3 different elevations." The room didn't just go quiet. The room dissolved into something else entirely. News cameras panned across the assembled faces. The hospital administrator was pale. The union representative had tears on her face. And then, as if on cue, because apparently the military had coordinated timing like they coordinated everything else, 2 Navy investigators in dark suits walked through the lobby doors with federal badges visible on their belts. "We've been tracking the individual currently admitted to this hospital's medical ward under asylum status," one of them said, their voice carrying through the lobby with the weight of official procedure. "He's wanted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. We need testimony from the medical provider who treated him after his capture in 2011. Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen was that provider. She also apprehended him during that operation. Her testimony will be critical to prosecution." What happened next wasn't dramatic in the way movies make things dramatic. It was administrative. It was bureaucratic. A vice admiral, the same Patricia Chen who'd vouched for Sarah, walked to the podium, and she didn't ask Dr. Sterling to leave quietly. She didn't offer him an opportunity to resign. She simply spoke his name into the microphone and told him that his medical license faced formal review, that his hospital credentials were being stripped effective immediately, and that security would escort him from the building. She said the words, "Your actions endangered a child's life and you weaponized institutional authority to protect your reputation," and with each sentence, she was stripping away something he'd spent 30 years building. Dr. Sterling stood motionless in the middle of the hospital lobby while security officers approached. His face went the color of old newspaper. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain. He just let them walk him toward the exit. His hospital ID badge fell from his pocket and clattered on the marble floor. Nobody picked it up. News cameras captured every second of it. 2 months later, a nurse named Rodriguez from Oak Creek's emergency department was driving through a strip mall in El Cajon, near the border, when she spotted a man sitting at a folding table between a tax preparation service and a vape shop. He was wearing a cheap polo shirt with an insurance company logo, and he was trying to convince a disinterested woman to buy supplemental health coverage. It took Rodriguez a moment to recognize him. Dr. Sterling looked smaller somehow, like something essential had been removed. He saw her staring, and his face went red. She saw the shame there, the weight of watching your entire professional identity disintegrate over the course of 8 weeks. She took a photograph. Within an hour, it had circulated through Oak Creek's break room. Dr. Webb sent it to Sarah with a single text message, "Karma." The boy's experimental surgery had been a success. 70% vision restoration, with specialists predicting continued neural recovery over the next 6 months. The Admiral gave one interview to the regional news, and he mentioned Sarah by name, crediting her emergency intervention with preserving the optic nerve structure. The story made medical journals. Combat Medics Field Procedure enables successful pediatric vision restoration. Sarah's name was in print for the first time in 18 years, and she didn't see it. She was too busy watching the news footage of Dr. Sterling being walked out of the hospital. She was too busy feeling that strange mix of vindication and emptiness that comes when the person who hurt you gets hurt in return, and you realize it doesn't actually make the original wound feel any better. But then the Admiral called her personally and offered her something, the chance to start over. Oak Creek Memorial was building a new veteran trauma unit, and he wanted Sarah to direct it. Full funding. Full authority. No oversight except her own ethics. She accepted before he finished the sentence. 6 months later, Sarah worked in that unit, in an office overlooking San Diego Bay, where morning light came through windows that weren't reinforced against small arms fire. On her office wall hung 2 things that had defined her, a faded unit patch from Sangin, the one she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining all these years, now professionally framed with her Navy Cross citation. And beside it, a photograph of the Admiral's son taking his first steps without assistance, his restored sight allowing him to navigate the world independently, his smile pointing toward a future that almost didn't happen. Young veterans filled her waiting room every morning. Some from Sangin. Others from Kandahar, from Marja, from places that had no names on public maps. All of them broken in ways that civilians couldn't see. All of them needing someone who understood. Dr. Webb stopped by most mornings now, and together they'd created something new, a program training combat medics to transition into civilian healthcare, giving other people the chance Sarah hadn't had, to heal on purpose, in the light, with their true names. During the unit's ribbon-cutting ceremony, the Admiral presented Sarah with a leather-bound book. Inside were letters from the 4 sailors she'd carried through enemy fire in Sangin, names she'd carried for 18 years without speaking them aloud. They were alive. They had families now. They had children who would grow up because Sarah's hands had remembered their training under the worst possible pressure. She stood at the podium in front of assembled military officers, hospital administrators, and media, and her voice came out steady and clear, not the soft, deferential voice of the night shift nurse anymore, but the voice of someone who'd learned her own authority in the worst possible places. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," Sarah said. "Medicine isn't about reputation or politics. It's about showing up in the dark when everyone else walks away. It's about remembering that the person in front of you is someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's reason for coming home. And sometimes, the bravest thing a healer can do is refuse to compromise on that. Just once. Just when it matters most." The audience stood. Through the windows behind her, the bay stretched endless and blue, and for the first time in 18 years, Sarah Chen felt like she'd finally come home to herself. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, I want to hear your story. Subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment, because the quiet ones among us deserve to be seen. And if you know someone who's sacrificed everything to heal, thank them today.